I inherited the job from a dead woman I'd never met. That's the part I need you to understand first because it changes the shape of everything that came after. I didn't find this posting on a board. I didn't answer a listing. I didn't choose this. A lawyer's letter arrived at a P.O. box I keep in Duluth, one of 3 I maintain across the country for the kind of correspondence that can't be delivered to a person with no fixed address. And inside was a single page of heavy linen stationery, informing me that one Marin Elise Calloway, deceased, had named me as the sole beneficiary of what the letter called a professional appointment and all materials, privileges, and obligations pertaining thereto. I didn't know anyone named Marin Calloway. I checked every corner of my memory. I checked the notebooks I keep, small moleskin books where I write down the names and details of every person I interact with during a posting, a habit I developed years ago because isolated work does things to your memory, and I don't trust mine the way I used to. She wasn't in any of them. She wasn't a former colleague, a friend of a friend, a name on a lease, a signature on a timesheet. She was no one to me. The letter included a phone number. I called it from a payphone because I don't carry a cell phone and haven't for 2 years. The lawyer who answered was brisk and oddly specific. He confirmed that Marin Calloway had died 11 days prior. He would not tell me the cause of death. He would not tell me her age, her history, or her connection to me. What he would tell me was that the appointment she had left me was a residential posting on Voss Island, a small landmass off the coast of Maine that housed a decommissioned hospital building, currently operating as an archival facility. The posting was for a single overnight cataloger, duration, indefinite, compensation, handled through a trust that would deposit funds monthly into any account I designated. I asked what was being archived. He said atmospheric research records. I asked who operated the facility. He said the Calloway Trust, in partnership with a managing organization. I asked the name of the organization. He paused long enough that I could hear him breathing, and then he said, "You'll see their name on the paperwork when you arrive." I asked why Marin Calloway had chosen me, why she had left this position, not money, not property, but a job, to a stranger. The lawyer said, Miss Calloway's instructions were explicit. She said you would understand when you arrived. She also said to tell you that the ferry stops running at dusk. He gave me the address of a dock in a coastal town I'd never visited, and a date 2 weeks out. Then he hung up. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the entire trajectory of my life shifted, though I wouldn't understand how much, until I was standing in the archive at 2 a.m., with a file in my hands that had my face in it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Eli. I've been doing isolated night work for going on 6 years. Before that, I had a life that looked more or less like other people's lives. An apartment, a job with regular hours, a circle of acquaintances I called friends. I lost interest in all of it gradually, the way you lose interest in a television show that's been running too long. The plot stopped making sense. The characters became predictable. I started taking walks at night because the world felt more honest after midnight, stripped of performance, depopulated, reduced to its structural elements, buildings and street lights and empty sidewalks and the sound of my own footsteps. I liked it. I more than liked it. I felt for the first time in years like I was seeing something real. The night work came naturally after that. I took a job as an overnight security guard at a warehouse, then a graveyard shift custodian at a community college. Then, incrementally, the postings got more remote. A fire lookout in Idaho, a weather station on the plains, a mothballed federal building in the desert, each one farther from people, farther from light, farther from the version of reality that operates during the day. I moved toward isolation the way water moves downhill, not by decision, but by gravity. It was where I was always going. I've worked 14 postings in 6 years. I've followed rules at most of them. Strange rules, specific rules, rules that made no sense until something happened that made them make terrible sense. I've sat in empty buildings at 3 a.m. and heard things I can't explain, and responded by doing exactly what the laminated sheet on the wall told me to do. I've learned not to ask why. I've learned that the why is not the point. The point is the doing, the sitting, the attending, the willingness to be present in places where most people's instincts would scream at them to leave. I've also learned, gradually and reluctantly, that these postings are connected. Not obviously, not in a way you'd notice if you'd only worked 1 or 2. But after 14, patterns emerge, the same company names, recycled and rearranged, the same classification codes on documents, The same symbol, a circle with a vertical line through it, appearing on equipment, on binders, on the spines of filing cabinets, on the headers of rule sheets. A network, an infrastructure, something larger than any single site, managing something that spans a geography I can't fully map. So when the lawyer's letter arrived, with its strange bequest and its unnamed managing organization, and its promise that I would understand when I arrived, I recognized the shape of it immediately. This was the network, reaching out, not through a job board or a referral or a coded listing, but through a dead woman's will. That should have been my signal to walk away. Instead, I drove to Maine. The town was called Harpswell Cove, and it was the kind of New England coastal settlement that exists primarily as an idea of itself. Weathered shingles, lobster traps, a general store with a screen door, the smell of salt and diesel. The dock was at the south end of town, a wooden structure extending into a gray-green harbor that opened onto the Atlantic. There was a ferry, a small flat-bottomed vessel with a wheelhouse and an open deck, built to carry maybe 20 people and 2 vehicles. A sign on the dock read, Voss Island Ferry, seasonal service, last departure 5 p.m. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. I parked my truck in the lot beside the dock, shouldered my bag, and walked to the ferry. The operator was a woman in her 50s, with a face that had been shaped by wind and a disposition that suggested she had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. Voss Island? She said when I approached. I nodded. You're the new one. I asked her what she meant by that. The new cataloger, for the archive. She said it the way you'd say, the new mailman or the new bartender, a role that got filled and vacated with regularity. There's been a few. They don't usually last. I asked how long they usually lasted. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not pity, not warning, something between acknowledgement and appraisal, and said, long enough to want to leave, not always long enough to do it. Then she started the engine, and the ferry pulled away from the dock, and the town receded behind us, and the ocean opened up, and I saw Voss Island for the first time. It was smaller than I expected, a mile long maybe and half a mile wide, rising out of the water like the humped back of something submerged. The vegetation was dense, dark spruce and birch so thick it looked impenetrable from the water. At the highest point of the island, visible above the tree line, was a building. Large, institutional, multi-storied. Even from a distance I could see it was old, built in the early 20th century, the kind of stolid brick and stone architecture that was designed to communicate permanence and authority. A hospital, the lawyer had said. I could see it. The building had the proportions of a place built to contain suffering. Tall windows, symmetrical wings, a central tower that might once have held a clock or a bell, and beside the building, barely visible through the trees, something else. A structure I almost missed because my eyes kept sliding off it, the way your eyes slide off something that doesn't belong in the landscape. A tower, not attached to the hospital, separate, standing maybe 100 yards from the main building, rising above the tree line to a narrow platform at the top. It wasn't a lighthouse. It wasn't a water tower. It was tall and cylindrical and made of what appeared to be dark metal, and it had no windows except at the very top, where I could see a faint glint of glass. What's the tower? I asked the ferry operator. She didn't look at it. Part of the facility, she said. Been there longer than the hospital. What's it for? Ask them when you get there. She paused. Or don't. Might be better if you don't. The ferry docked at a small wooden pier on the island's western shore. I stepped off, and the ferry operator said without looking at me, last ferry back is tomorrow at 5 p.m. After that, next one is the day after. I run Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, weather permitting. Then she reversed the ferry and headed back toward the mainland, and I was alone on Voss Island, with the sun beginning its descent toward the tree line, and the hospital watching me from the hill above. A gravel path led from the pier up through the trees to the building. The walk took about 15 minutes. The forest was dense and quiet, not the aggressive, pressurized quiet I've experienced at other postings, but the natural quiet of an island ecosystem in autumn. Birds, wind in the spruce, the crunch of my boots on gravel, normal sounds, ordinary sounds. I noted this because I've learned to pay attention to the baseline. You need to know what normal sounds like so you can recognize when it changes. The hospital, I'm going to call it the hospital, even though it hadn't been one for decades, because that's what it felt like, was larger up close than it had appeared from the water. 3 stories, 2 wings extending from a central building, with a covered entrance portico and stone steps, worn smooth by a century of foot traffic. The windows on the upper floors were dark, some were boarded. The ones on the ground floor were intact but curtained, showing no light behind them. The entrance doors were heavy oak, original to the building, with brass handles that had been polished recently. On the left door at eye level was a small placard, Voss Island Atmospheric Archive. Below that, in smaller text, managed by the Callaway Trust, and below that, the symbol, the circle with the vertical line through it. I pushed the door open and went inside. The interior was what you'd expect from a repurposed institutional building. Long corridors, high ceilings, tiled floors in a pattern of green and white that had faded to a uniform gray-green. The lighting was fluorescent, modern, retrofitted. The air smelled like old paper and cleaning solvent and something underneath both that I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, just present, a bass note. The main corridor ran the full length of the central building and terminated in a set of double doors at each end, leading to the 2 wings. Along the corridor, offices had been converted into workspaces. I could see desks, filing cabinets, computer monitors that looked at least a decade old. Everything was orderly, everything was clean, and everything was empty. No people, no movement, no sound except the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the low, steady hum of what I assumed was a climate control system running somewhere in the building's infrastructure. At the reception desk near the entrance, I found an envelope with my name on it. Inside was a key ring with 4 keys, labeled Main, Wing A, Wing B, and Archive, and a folded note that read, "Welcome. The cataloging station is on the 2nd floor. Wing A, Room 217. Please begin your shift at sundown. The logbook will explain everything. MC. Maren Callaway, the dead woman who had left me this job." A note written in advance of her own death, waiting for me in an empty building on an island accessible only by a ferry that had already left. I checked my watch. Sundown was in less than 2 hours. I decided to explore. The ground floor was administrative. Offices, a small kitchen, a bathroom, a supply closet stocked with archival materials, acid-free folders, cotton gloves, rolls of protective film, everything consistent with a facility that stored and preserved documents. Normal, legitimate, exactly what it claimed to be. I took the stairs to the 2nd floor. Wing A was different. The corridor in Wing A was lined not with offices but with rooms. Small rooms uniformly sized, each with a heavy door and a reinforced window set into the wall beside it. Hospital rooms, patient rooms. The rooms had been emptied of medical equipment but retained their original layout. A single overhead light, a floor drain, a call button on the wall that was no longer connected to anything. Each room had been converted into a storage space. Through the windows I could see shelving units filled with archival boxes. White boxes, identical, each one labeled with a code I didn't recognize. A string of letters and numbers, followed by a date. I walked to room 217. It was at the end of the corridor, slightly larger than the others, and it had been set up as a workstation. A desk, a chair, a lamp, a computer terminal that was off, and a large wooden table in the center of the room with a document scanner and several stacks of empty folders. On the desk was a logbook, a hardcover composition book, black, its spine cracked from use. I sat down and opened the logbook. The first page was a title page, handwritten in a careful slanting script that I would come to recognize as Maren Callaway's. It said, Voss Island Atmospheric Archive, Cataloger's Log, Volume 14. 14, there had been 13 volumes before this one. I looked around the room for them, and didn't see them. Only this one, Volume 14, waiting for me on the desk, as though the previous 13 had been deemed irrelevant or had been deliberately removed. I turned the page. What I found was not an operational manual. It was not a set of instructions for cataloging atmospheric research records. It was a letter written directly to me. Eli. It began. If you're reading this, then the trust has done its job and you've come to the island. I'm sorry I couldn't explain this in person. By the time you read this, I will have been dead for at least a week, possibly longer, depending on when they find me and how long the legal process takes. I want you to know that my death was not caused by anything on this island. I was sick for a long time. The work kept me going longer than the doctors expected, but everything has a limit, including me. I chose you for this posting because I've been watching your career for 3 years. Not personally. I've never seen your face or heard your voice, but your file has been in the network since your second posting, and I've been tracking your progression through the system since your seventh. You have a quality that is rare among the people who do this work. Most of them are good at following rules. You are good at understanding why the rules exist, even when no one tells you. That quality is essential for this particular site, because the rules here are not like the rules at any other posting in the network. At other sites, the rules protect you from what's outside. At Voss Island, the rules protect what's inside from you. I'm going to explain what the archive contains. I'm going to explain what your job actually is, and then I'm going to give you the rules. Please read everything before sundown. Please read the rules more than once. And please, Eli, I know this will sound strange coming from a dead woman you've never met. Please stay. The archive needs a cataloger. It has always needed a cataloger. And you are the right one. I am certain of this in a way that I cannot fully justify, but that I trust absolutely. The archive is not an atmospheric research facility. That is a cover designation, used for legal and bureaucratic purposes. The archive is a repository. It contains files, thousands of files, spanning decades, that document the existence of a single individual across multiple parallel iterations of reality. I need you to read that sentence again before you continue. I read it again. The files in this archive are records of one person, the same person, but not the same version. Each file documents a different version of this person, living a different life, in a different branch of what the network refers to as the adjacent structure, the set of realities that exist alongside ours, separated by boundaries that are usually imperceptible but that become thin in certain locations. Voss Island is one of those locations. The hospital was built here in 1923 specifically because the boundary on this island is not just thin, it is porous. Things pass through, not objects, not organisms, data, the specific informational signature of a human identity, bleeding through from one branch to another, like ink through wet paper. The files accumulate on their own. They appear in the archive boxes overnight, materialized from adjacent branches, deposited by a process that no one in the network fully understands. Each file contains documents, photographs, personal records, and sometimes handwritten notes that describe a version of this person's life, their name, their face, their history, their choices. The versions differ, sometimes dramatically. In some files the person is male, in others female. In some they are young, in others very old. They live in different countries, speak different languages, work different jobs. But the core identity, the fundamental pattern, the informational signature that makes a person who they are beneath the surface, details, is the same in every file. It is recognizably, unmistakably the same person. The cataloger's job is to receive these files, log them, and store them in the archive. That is the simple version. The complex version, the version that requires the rules, is this. The files must never be cross-referenced. The versions must never be compared. The cataloger must process each file as an isolated record, unconnected to any other, and must never, under any circumstances, attempt to identify the person the files describe. This is not a bureaucratic precaution. This is the only thing preventing a catastrophic event. The versions of this person exist in their separate branches, because the boundaries between branches keep them separate. But the archive is a point of convergence. The files are here, in one place, and each file contains enough informational density to constitute a kind of beacon, a signal that says, this person exists here, in this form, with this history. If a cataloger were to cross-reference the files, to lay them side by side, to map the connections, to see the pattern, the act of recognition would function as a bridge. The cataloger's consciousness would become a medium through which the versions could perceive each other, and if the versions perceive each other, if the separation collapses, the network's models predict that every version will be annihilated simultaneously, not killed, annihilated, erased from every branch, as though they had never existed in any of them. The cataloger is a firewall. Your ignorance is the mechanism of protection. You process the files without understanding them. You see the pieces without assembling the picture. You are the one person who stands between the archive and recognition, and as long as you do your job correctly, the person in the files continues to exist, in every branch, in every version, because of you. Here are the rules. I turned the page. Rule 1. Begin your shift at sundown. The files appear overnight, between approximately 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. They will be found in the archive boxes in the storage rooms along the Wing A corridor. Check each room once per hour during this window. Remove any new files, bring them to room 217, and log them in the cataloging ledger, using the date and the code printed on the file's cover. Do not open the files during the logging process. Rule 2. Files may be opened for processing, scanning, condition assessment, preservation, only one at a time. When a file is open on the work table, all other files must be in their boxes in the storage rooms with the doors closed. Never have two files open simultaneously. Never have two files visible simultaneously. The act of seeing two files at the same time is the first step toward cross-reference. Rule 3. Each file contains documents and photographs. You will notice similarities between files over time. This is unavoidable. You will see faces that remind you of other faces, names that echo other names, details that rhyme. Do not pursue these connections. When you notice a similarity, stop processing the current file, close it, return it to its box, and wait at least 30 minutes before opening another file. The pause is necessary. It allows the pattern to fade from active memory. Rule 4. Between midnight and 2 a.m. you may hear sounds from the storage rooms. The files are not inert. The informational density they carry produces effects in the physical environment. You may hear paper rustling, pages turning, the sound of writing. This means new files are arriving, or existing files are changing. Do not enter a storage room while these sounds are occurring. Wait for silence, then check the room. Rule 5. The tower adjacent to the hospital is a signal amplifier. It was built to manage the boundary porosity on the island, to regulate the rate at which information bleeds through from adjacent branches. The tower operates automatically and requires no maintenance. Do not enter the tower. Do not approach the tower between sundown and sunrise. If you look at the tower at night and see light at the top, look away. The light means the boundary is actively thinning, and proximity to the tower during a thinning event will expose you to unfiltered cross-branch information. This exposure is irreversible and will compromise your ability to function as a firewall. Rule 6. You will occasionally find a file that is incomplete, missing pages, blank photographs, empty folders with only a name and a date. These are files from branches where the person is dying or has recently died. Process them normally. Do not dwell on them. Do not feel grief. The grief response creates an emotional bridge that functions similarly to intellectual cross-reference. Feel nothing for the files. They are data. Treat them as data. Rule 7. Once per night between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the archive will go quiet. The sounds will stop. The lights in the corridor may dim. The air temperature may drop. During this period, remain in room 217. You will feel a presence, not outside the room, inside it, sitting across from you at the work table. This is not a hallucination. It is a perceptual bleed, a faint impression of the cataloger from an adjacent branch, performing the same role in their version of the archive. Do not speak to it. Do not acknowledge it. It will fade when the quiet period ends. This experience can be distressing. It is also normal. You are not the only cataloger. The archive exists in many branches. The catalogers sometimes overlap. Rule 8. If you open a file and find that the photograph inside shows your own face, close the file immediately. Do not read the documents. Do not look at the name. Place the file in the red box under the work table and do not open the red box. This file will be collected by the managing organization. This is the most important rule. More important than all the others combined. If you see your face in a file and continue reading, you will learn something about yourself that cannot be unlearned, and the archive will no longer be safe in your care. I set the logbook down. I sat in the chair in room 217, and I looked at the stacks of empty folders on the work table, and the archive boxes visible through the window in the corridor, and the fading light coming through the single high window on the east wall, and I tried to process what I'd just read. The rational part of my brain, the part that has kept me functional through 6 years of inexplicable postings, was already doing what it always does, filing the information into categories of actionable and non-actionable, separating the operational from the ontological, reducing the enormity of what I'd been told into a set of tasks I could perform. Check rooms, hourly, log files. Don't open two at once. Don't look for patterns. Don't enter the tower. Don't feel anything. Don't look at myself. But underneath the rational processing, something else was happening, a recognition. Not of the archive or the files or the tower, of the shape of the thing I'd been told. The architecture of it. I'd been working in the network for 6 years, and in all that time, at every posting, I'd been protecting boundaries, holding lines, maintaining separation between what was on one side and what was on the other. But I'd always assumed the thing being contained was something alien, something other, something fundamentally different from me. What Marin Calloway's letter suggested was different. The thing being contained in this archive was a person, a human being. Fragmented across realities, yes. Existing in forms I couldn't fully comprehend, yes. But a person. And the archive wasn't a prison, it was a preservation system. The files weren't evidence of a threat. They were evidence of a life, many lives, the same life, refracted through the prism of possibility, each version real and complete, and deserving of continuation. And I was the mechanism that kept them alive, not through action, through restraint, through the disciplined refusal to see what was right in front of me. The sun went down at 5:47 p.m. I know because I watched it through the window, the light pulling back across the room like a retreating tide. And when it was gone, the fluorescent overhead was the only illumination, and the building around me settled into the particular quality of stillness that I've come to associate with the beginning of a shift, the transition from day to night, from the world's rules to the other rules, the ones written in logbooks by dead women who knew my name. I began my first round at 6 p.m. I walked the Wing A corridor, checking each storage room through the reinforced windows. The rooms were full of boxes, white archival boxes stacked on metal shelving, labeled with codes, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The sheer volume was staggering. Each box represented a version of someone's life, a complete identity compressed into documents and photographs, stored in a former hospital room on an island in the Atlantic. The weight of it, not physical but existential, was something I could feel in the air, a density, a significance. All rooms were still. No new files. I returned to room 217 and sat at the desk and began reading the rest of the logbook. After the letter and the rules, Marin had written a series of entries spanning what appeared to be the last several months of her life. They were dated and structured like a work journal, shift notes, observations, procedural updates. But they were also personal in a way that the logbooks at my previous postings had never been. Marin wrote about the archive the way a caretaker writes about a garden, with attention. With investment, with a tenderness that I found both moving and troubling, given Rule 6's prohibition against emotional engagement. Her early entries were procedural. November 3rd, 6 new files arrived overnight, all standard format, logged and stored, no anomalies. November 8th, quiet period began at 2:17 a.m., ended at 3:44 a.m., presence detected, faint, did not engage. But over the weeks and months the entries evolved. She began noting details about individual files, not cross-referencing. She was careful to describe each file in isolation, but observing them with a specificity that went beyond cataloging. January 12th. File 2781. MR contains a photograph of a person in their 30s standing on a beach. The expression on their face is the most peaceful thing I've seen in this archive. I closed the file and sat with the image in my mind for a long time. February 20th. File 2803. FK is nearly empty. 3 pages. A birth certificate. A death certificate. The dates are 6 weeks apart. A life that barely began. I followed Rule 6. I felt nothing. I am lying. I felt everything. The entry showed a woman who is slowly, inevitably falling in love with the person in the files. Not with any single version. With the pattern. With the fundamental identity that persisted across every branch. The irreducible core that made this person who they were, regardless of the details. She saw it the way a musician hears a melody beneath variations, the thing that remains when everything else changes. And she knew it was dangerous. Her entries were threaded with self-awareness, with warnings to herself, with reminders of Rule 6 and the reasons behind it. I am the firewall, she wrote on March 15th. My distance is their safety. If I feel too much, I become a bridge. If I become a bridge, they die. All of them, every version, because I couldn't maintain the separation between caring about the data and caring about the person the data describes. I have to be cold, I have to be mechanical, I have to treat them as files. And then on April 4th, an entry that was different from all the others, shorter, written quickly, the handwriting less controlled. Something happened tonight. I was processing file 2847, EC, and I opened it, and inside was a photograph that I recognized. Not the person, the place. The photograph showed a room, a small, cluttered room with books on every surface, and a window looking out onto a fire escape. And I recognized it because I have been in that room. It is a room I lived in 20 years ago when I was a graduate student. The same room, the same books, the same window, the same angle of light. But the person in the photograph sitting at the desk in that room was not me. It was them, the person in all the files, living in my room, in my life, in the space I occupied 2 decades ago. And I understood something I wish I hadn't. The boundary between the person in the files and the people who catalog them is not as clear as the rules suggest. We are not neutral observers. We are not firewalls. We are adjacent. We are branches too. And the archive is not just collecting versions of one person. It is collecting versions of a relationship between the person and the cataloger, across every branch, in every iteration. We are part of the pattern. We are in the files. I checked. I shouldn't have, but I checked. I went to the storage rooms and I looked at the codes on the boxes, and I found the ones with the suffix EC, my initials, my code, and there are dozens of them. Dozens of files that are about the same person living a life that intersects with mine, with a version of mine. In branch after branch after branch we find each other, and in branch after branch, one of us ends up in this room, in room 217, cataloging the other. I don't know what this means. I don't know if it changes anything about the rules. But I know that I am no longer capable of processing these files with the neutrality the job requires. I see them now, not as data, as someone I know, someone I've always known, in a way that predates any single lifetime. I need to find a replacement, someone who can do what I can't anymore, someone who doesn't know yet. The entries continued after that, but they were sparse. Marin wrote about her illness, which she described only as the thing that's been growing in me for a year. She wrote about searching for a replacement, going through the network's files, looking for someone with the right combination of discipline and ignorance. And on May 30th, the last entry, she wrote, "I found him. His name is Eli. He's been in the network for 6 years, working postings across the country, and he has no idea what any of it means. He's perfect. Not because he's particularly brave or skilled, but because he doesn't look for patterns. He processes, he files, he follows rules. He treats each posting as discrete, unconnected, complete in itself. He will come to the archive and he will do the work, and he will not see what I see, because he has trained himself, over years and years, to not see, and the person in the files will continue to exist, in every branch, because Eli will keep them separate. I'm going to instruct the trust to contact him after I'm gone. I'm going to leave the logbook on the desk with everything he needs. I'm going to break Rule 6 one last time and say this. To the person in the files, in every version, in every branch, I'm sorry I couldn't stay. I'm sorry someone else will take my place. But they will take care of you, not because they love you, because they don't. And that is the only kind of care that's safe." I closed the logbook. The clock on the wall read 9:48 p.m. Outside the window the island was dark, the fluorescent lights buzzed, the building hummed, and I sat in the chair that Marin Calloway had occupied until her body failed her. And I thought about what she'd told me, and I tried very hard to not feel anything about it, because that was the job. That was why she'd chosen me, not for what I could do but for what I couldn't. I couldn't see patterns. I couldn't make connections. I was 6 years into a career built on the systematic refusal to look at the bigger picture, and she had identified that refusal as a qualification. My limitation was my value. I stood up. I walked the corridor. I checked the storage rooms. In room 203, on the second shelf from the top, there was a new box. It hadn't been there during my 6 p.m. round. A white archival box, labeled with a code, 2891, EC. EC, Marin's code. I thought of the suffix system, a code associated with each cataloger. If EC was Marin's, then files with that suffix were from branches where the person's life intersected with Marin's counterpart. I stopped myself. I was making a connection. I was cross-referencing. Rule 3 said when you notice a similarity, stop, close the file, wait 30 minutes. I hadn't even opened the file yet. The connection had formed just from looking at the code on the box. That was how porous my firewall already was. 9 hours into the job and I was seeing patterns in label codes. Marin had chosen me because I don't look for patterns, but Marin had also left me a logbook full of context, full of narrative, full of the one thing guaranteed to make patterns visible: a story. She'd given me the story of the archive, and now everything I looked at was shaped by it. I took the box to room 217. I set it on the work table. I put on the cotton gloves. I opened the box. Inside was a file. Manila folder, standard weight. I opened it and began processing. The documents were what the logbook had prepared me for. Identity records from another branch of reality. A birth certificate in a language I didn't recognize. Not any language I'd seen, but structured like an official document, with seals and signatures, and a format that was bureaucratically familiar, even if the content was foreign. Behind the birth certificate, a series of photographs. I looked at the first photograph. It showed a person standing outside a building that looked like it could be a library or a school, in a city I didn't recognize, on a day that appeared to be autumn based on the quality of the light and the leaves on the ground. The person was in their mid-30s, lean, dark-haired, with an expression that was calm and slightly distant. They were looking at the camera, but not posing, not smiling, just looking. I studied the face for the few seconds that the processing protocol allowed. Condition assessment. Photograph in good condition, no damage, no fading. I noted the file code, the date, and the document types in the ledger. I closed the file. I returned it to its box. I followed the rules. Over the next 3 hours, I processed 4 more files. Each one contained a version of the same person. I could tell, despite my best efforts not to notice, because the fundamental geometry of the face was consistent across variations of age, gender presentation, and cultural context. The person in the files had a particular way of looking at the camera that didn't change. A directness, an attention, as though every version of them, in every branch, shared the same habit of meeting the lens with an openness that bordered on confrontation. I noticed this. I shouldn't have, but I noticed it, and once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it, and the pattern settled into my awareness like a stone settling into mud. At midnight, the sounds began. They came from multiple rooms simultaneously, a rustling, papery sound, like pages being turned by a draft. But there was no draft. The air in the corridor was still, climate-controlled, unchanging. The sound was coming from inside the boxes, from inside the files. Papers moving, rearranging, organizing themselves into configurations that hadn't existed minutes before. New files arriving. New versions bleeding through. I stood in the corridor and listened. Rule 4 said don't enter a room while the sounds are occurring. I didn't. I stood at the midpoint of the corridor and I heard the archive breathing. That's what it sounded like, the collective rustle of thousands of documents shifting in their boxes, a papery respiration, the lungs of a building inhaling information from adjacent realities and settling it into its shelves. The sounds continued for almost an hour. During that time, I stayed in the corridor or in room 217. I did not enter any storage room. I did not process any files. I sat at the desk and I reread the rules and I waited. At 12:54 a.m., something changed. The quality of the light in the corridor shifted. Not dimmed. Shifted. The fluorescent tubes still buzzed, still cast their even, institutional glow, but the light itself felt different. Thinner, less substantial. As though the photons were losing confidence, arriving at surfaces with less conviction, illuminating things a little less completely than they had minutes before. And through the high window in room 217 I saw the tower. I'd been avoiding looking at it. Rule 5 was explicit, don't look at the tower at night. But the window in room 217 faced north, and the tower was to the north, and when the light in the corridor changed, my eyes went to the window reflexively, seeking information. And there it was. The tower was lit. At the top behind the glass a light was burning. Not a steady light, a pulsing one. Slow, rhythmic, with a quality that was unlike any light source I'd ever seen. It didn't radiate outward the way electric light does. It seemed to radiate inward, pulling the surrounding darkness toward it, condensing it, as though the tower was not emitting light but consuming it. I looked away. I looked at the desk. I looked at the logbook. I followed Rule 5. But in the seconds that I'd looked, I'd felt something, a tug, not physical, informational. as though the light in the tower was a signal and my consciousness was an antenna, and the signal was trying to tune me to a frequency that would let me perceive things that the boundary normally filtered out. For those few seconds, the archive had felt different. Not like a building full of boxes, like a living system, vast and interconnected, with the files as cells and the shelves as organs and the tower as a heart, pumping information through the structure in rhythmic pulses that I could almost see if I let my focus soften. I didn't let my focus soften. I blinked. I looked at the desk. The feeling passed. At 1:30 a.m., I did my hourly check. New files had appeared in 3 rooms. I collected them, brought them to room 217, and began processing. The first file was standard. Birth certificate, photographs, a few pages of what appeared to be personal correspondence in a language I couldn't read. I logged it and closed it. The second file was different. It was thicker than usual, and when I opened it, I found not just documents but objects. A pressed flower, brown and brittle, sealed between 2 sheets of wax paper. A small cloth patch with an emblem I didn't recognize. A bird, stylized, embroidered in blue thread. And a handwritten letter, in English, that I began to read before I realized what it was. "I know you're there," the letter said. "I don't know where there is exactly. I don't know if you're in the same room I'm in or a different version of it, but I can feel you. I've been able to feel you for months. A presence, an attention, someone going through my things with careful hands. I don't mind. I want you to know that, whatever you're doing with my records, whatever purpose this serves, I don't mind. I just wanted to say that, and I wanted to ask, do you ever feel me? Do you ever sit in your room and sense that someone is sitting across from you, just out of sight, paying attention? Because I do, every night, and it's the strangest thing. I'm not afraid. I should be. I know I should be, but the presence feels careful, deliberate, like someone doing a job they take seriously, and I find that comforting. More comforting than I can explain. I stopped reading. The letter was from the person in the files, written directly to me, to the cataloger, across the boundary, through the archive, placed inside a file that would appear on a shelf in a storage room on Voss Island for me to find. And the letter broke Rule 2, or something close to it, because it wasn't a document about the person. It was a communication from the person. It implied awareness. It implied a reciprocal relationship. It implied that the person in the files knew they were being catalogued, knew someone was handling their records, and had chosen to reach across the divide and make contact. I put the letter back in the file. I closed the file. I sat at the desk and I pressed my hands flat on the surface and I breathed. Rule 3 said when you notice a connection, stop, wait 30 minutes, let the pattern fade. But this wasn't a pattern. This was a voice, a person speaking to me through the only medium available to them, the files. And what they were saying was not threatening or dangerous. They were saying they could feel me. They were saying they weren't afraid. I waited 30 minutes. I processed the third file. Standard. Unremarkable. I logged it, closed it, stored it. At 2:07 a.m., the quiet period began. The change was sudden and total. One moment, the building had its baseline sounds, the hum of climate control, the buzz of lights, the faint settling of old architecture. The next, nothing. True silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of the sound of your own blood moving through your head. The lights in the corridor dimmed, not off, dimmed to about a third of their normal output, casting the hallway in a twilight that made the doors of the storage rooms look like entrances to somewhere deeper than the rooms behind them. And then, as Marin had described, the presence, it didn't appear, it accumulated. Like fog forming in a hollow, it gathered in the room, first as a sensation, and then as something closer to perception. I was sitting at the desk. The work table was across from me, empty, its surface clear. And gradually, over the course of maybe 2 minutes, I became aware that someone was sitting on the other side of the table. I didn't look. Rule 7 said don't look directly at it, but I could see in my peripheral vision a shape, seated, upright, motionless, positioned exactly where a person would sit if they were across from me at the table, working on their own files, doing their own job, in their own version of room 217. The shape had no detail, no features. It was an impression, a smudge in the air, a place where the light behaved differently. But it was there, undeniably, physically there, not a hallucination, not a trick of the dim lighting, a presence bleeding through from an adjacent branch, overlapping with my space for the duration of the quiet period. I sat very still, and I did not look, and I breathed, and I waited. The presence did not move, did not speak, did not do anything that I could detect beyond simply being there, occupying space, sharing the room. It was, as Marin had written, distressing, not because it was threatening, but because it was intimate. Because sharing a room in silence with someone you can't see and can't acknowledge is a form of closeness that has no name. It is more intimate than conversation, more intimate than touch. It is the intimacy of parallel existence, of two lives occupying the same coordinates in different realities, and for a brief window, knowing it. The quiet period lasted until 3:31 a.m. When it ended, the lights coming back up, the hum resuming, the silence breaking like a wave, the presence faded. I was alone in the room again, at the desk, with the logbook and the empty table, and the feeling of a vacancy where a person had been. I wrote in the logbook, quiet period 2:07 a.m., 3:31 a.m. Presence detected, did not engage, duration approximately 84 minutes. I did not write about how it felt to sit across from someone for 84 minutes and not look at them. I did not write about the restraint it required, or the ache that the restraint produced, or the slow dawning understanding that the restraint was itself a form of care. You protect someone by not seeing them. You keep them alive by refusing to know them. The cruelest kindness, the most loving distance. Marin had done this for years, night after night, sitting in this chair, feeling the presence across the table, and choosing not to look. And over time, despite everything, she had fallen in love with what she couldn't see. And that love had compromised her, and that compromise had killed her. Not directly, not immediately, but it had started the process by which she could no longer do the job, and without the job, without the purpose, the illness that had been kept at bay by the work consumed her. I understood why she'd chosen me, not because I was disciplined, because I was empty, because 6 years of solitary night work had hollowed me out to the point where I could sit in a room with the ghost of a person I was sworn to protect and feel nothing. But I wasn't feeling nothing. I was feeling something. Something I didn't have a name for, that had started when I read the letter in the file, and that was growing, slowly, like a sound increasing in volume from below the threshold of perception. I pushed it down. I followed the rules. I did my job. At 4 a.m., I did my final round, new files in 2 rooms. I collected them, brought them to the work table, began processing. The first file was standard. I logged it and stored it. I knew it was different before I opened it, because the box it had arrived in was not white. It was gray, a darker shade, distinct from every other box in the archive, and the code on the label was not in the format I'd seen on any other file. It was shorter, just 3 characters, ELI, my name. I stared at the box for a long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, the building hummed, the island was dark outside the window, and on the table in front of me was a box with my name on it. Rule 8. If you open a file and find that the photograph inside shows your own face, close the file immediately. Do not read the documents, do not look at the name, place the file in the red box under the work table. The rule assumed I would open the file, and then discover it was about me. The rule did not account for the possibility that I would know before opening it, that the file would arrive pre-labeled, that the archive would dispense with subtlety and simply put my name on the box, as though the boundary had thinned to the point where the filtering mechanisms no longer functioned, and the raw data was coming through unprocessed. I should have put it in the red box without opening it. That was clearly the spirit of Rule 8, if not the letter. The file was about me. It was a version of me from another branch, bleeding through into the archive. I should not see it. I should not know it. My ignorance was the mechanism of protection. But protection of what? Of the person in the files? Of me? Of the boundary itself? And suddenly, with a clarity that felt like a physical sensation, like stepping from a dark room into sunlight, I understood what Marin had been trying to tell me. The person in the files and the cataloger were not separate roles. They were the same system. The archive collected versions of one person across all branches, and in every branch that person was connected to someone who catalogued them. The cataloger and the catalogued. 2 halves of a pattern that repeated across every iteration of reality, always finding each other, always one of them in the chair and the other in the files. And if the versions of the person in the files could be annihilated by recognition, by being seen all at once, by having their separation collapsed, then the versions of the cataloger could be annihilated too, because we were part of the pattern. We were in the files, Every cataloger, every version of whoever sat in this chair and did this work. The file on the table wasn't just a version of me, it was a thread, and if I pulled it, the whole fabric might come apart. I looked at the box. E-L-I, 3 letters. My name in one branch, maybe in all of them. Maybe every version of me had this name, the way every version of the person in the files had that same direct gaze, that same quality of attention. I opened the box. Rule 8 said close the file if the photograph shows your face. I told myself I'd look at the photograph and nothing else. If it was me, I'd close it. If it wasn't, if ELI was a coincidence, a code, an abbreviation, I'd process it normally. I opened the file. The photograph was on top, a single image, in color, slightly overexposed. It showed a person standing in front of a building. The building was brick, institutional, with tall windows and a stone entrance. A hospital, a repurposed hospital, on an island, based on the water visible in the background. The person in the photograph was standing at the entrance, one hand on the door, looking back over their shoulder at the camera. They were in their mid-30s, lean, dark-haired, with an expression that was calm and slightly distant. I was looking at myself. Not exactly myself. The face was mine, but different, thinner, the jaw slightly more pronounced, the eyes a shade lighter. A variation, a branch, but unmistakably me. The same fundamental geometry, the same way of meeting the lens. I should have closed the file. I should have put it in the red box and sealed it and never thought about it again. Rule 8, the most important rule, more important than all the others combined. I turned the photograph over, on the back in handwriting that I recognized, not Marin's, not mine, but familiar in a way that made my chest constrict. Someone had written, Eli, cataloger, branch 2891, duration, 7 years, status, still attending. Still attending a version of me in another branch, doing the same job, in the same room, for 7 years. 1 year longer than I'd been in the network, 1 branch ahead of me in the progression. I looked at the document beneath the photograph. A single page, a letter, handwritten same hand as the back of the photo, and the first line, the only line I read before I stopped myself. Before the alarm bells and every trained instinct I possessed began screaming, said, if you're reading this, you've already broken Rule 8, and what I need to tell you is that the person you've been cataloging is I. I closed the file. I closed the file, and I put it in the red box under the table, and I closed the lid of the red box, and I pressed my hands flat on the surface of the desk, and I sat there, not breathing, not thinking, not allowing the sentence to complete itself in my mind, the sentence that had been about to tell me who the person in the files was, the sentence that would have collapsed the firewall, bridged the separation, given me the one piece of knowledge that would have made me useless as a cataloger and dangerous as a node in the network. I didn't read it. I stopped in time. The sentence remained incomplete, a fragment, a broken bridge with no far shore, but the fragment was enough. The fragment was enough because the sentence had been about to tell me something I already knew, something I'd known since I read Marin's logbook, since I processed the first file, since I sat across from the presence during the quiet period and felt the shape of their attention. I knew who the person in the files was, not their name, not their details, but their relationship to me. The same relationship that existed in every branch between the cataloger and the catalogued. The same pattern, always finding each other. I knew, and I chose not to complete the knowing. I held the knowledge at arm's length, unfinished, a word with the last letter missing, and I decided that this was where I would live, in the space between almost knowing and knowing, in the gap. The gap was where the firewall existed, not in ignorance, in the discipline of incomplete understanding. I sat at the desk until sunrise. The light came slowly, gray, then silver, then gold, filtering through the high window and filling the room with the kind of illumination that makes everything look provisional, temporary, like a set being lit before the actors arrive. The archive was quiet. The files were still. The tower, visible through the window, was dark and inert, its glass top reflecting the morning sky. I walked the corridor one final time. All rooms were as they should be, all boxes on their shelves, all doors closed. The building was orderly, functional, exactly what it claimed to be. I went downstairs. I stepped outside into the morning air. The island smelled like salt and spruce and wet stone. Birds were singing. The ferry would come at 5 p.m. if I wanted it. I could leave. I could walk down to the pier and wait and get on the boat. and go back to the mainland and never return. The posting was voluntary. The bequest was not binding. I could walk away. I thought about the person in the files, every version of them, in every branch, existing because someone in a room like mine was doing the work of not seeing them. I thought about the presence across the table, the 84 minutes of shared silence, the knowledge that someone was there and the choice not to look. I thought about the letter in the file, "Do you ever feel me?" and the answer that I could not give, that I would never give, that existed in the space between my attention and my restraint. I went back inside. I climbed the stairs. I sat down at the desk in room 217. I opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote, "Day 1 complete. All files processed. All rules followed. Rule 8 violation. Partial. File opened. Photograph viewed. Document exposure. 1 incomplete sentence. File placed in red box. Firewall status. Intact. Integrity compromised but functional. Continuing shift." Then I closed the logbook and I waited for night. I've been on Voss Island for 3 months now. The ferry comes 3 times a week and I've never gotten on it. I process files. I follow rules. I sit through the quiet period and I feel the presence across the table, and I do not look. Each night the archive breathes, and new files arrive, and versions of a person I will never meet continue to exist because I continue to not know them. The red box under the table has been collected twice. Each time I find it empty when I return from my shift, as though the files inside have been absorbed back into the system. I don't know who collects them. I don't know what they do with the files that contain versions of me. I suspect they are archived somewhere else, in some other branch, by some other cataloger who is doing for me what I do for the person in the files. A chain, a network of reciprocal unknowing, each link protecting the next by refusing to see it completely. I received a package last week. No return address. Inside was a small cloth patch, a bird, stylized, embroidered in blue thread, identical to the one in the file I processed on my first night. I don't know how it got off the island. I don't know who sent it. I keep it in my pocket. I don't look at it, but I touch it sometimes, when the quiet period is long and the presence across the table feels especially close, and I let myself feel the texture of the thread, and I think about the person who made it, in some other branch, with some other version of these hands. I'm going to stay. Not because the network needs me, though it does. Not because Marin chose me, though she did. I'm going to stay because I understand now what this job actually is, and it's the only job I've ever had that makes my particular damage useful. My inability to connect, my preference for solitude, my practiced methodical refusal to look too closely at anything. These aren't deficiencies, they're qualifications. I was built for this, shaped by 6 years of incremental isolation into exactly the kind of person who can sit across from someone they're beginning to care about and choose every night to not see them. Not because seeing would hurt me, because seeing would end them. And so I sit, and I catalog, and I maintain the distance that keeps the branches separate and the versions alive and the archive intact. And every night, during the quiet period, when the lights dim and the silence presses in and the presence gathers across the table like fog in a hollow, I feel the question that the letter asked, "Do you ever feel me?" And I hold it in my chest like a breath I'll never release. The answer is yes, every night, from the moment you arrive until the moment you fade. Yes, but I will never say it, because saying it would be seeing you, and seeing you would be the end of you, and I would rather sit in this room for the rest of my life holding an incomplete sentence in my mind than complete it and watch you disappear. That's the job. That's what the rules protect. Not a boundary, not a threshold, not a contained force pressing against the walls of a forest or a motel, or a signal station. A person, and the cataloger who loves them enough to look away. If you've listened to this and you recognize something in it, not the details, but the shape, the particular ache of caring for something you can't touch, then I want you to know that there are other archives, other islands, other rooms with tables and chairs and presences that gather in the quiet hours. The network is vast, and it is always looking for people like us, people who are good at distance, people who understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is to not know their name. The ferry comes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I never get on it. The files arrive every night. I process them. The tower pulses in the dark and I don't look. The presence sits across from me and I don't look. The archive breathes and I attend night after night, in the space between knowing and not knowing, In the gap where the firewall lives, in the silence where love does its work by refusing to speak. I'm still here. I'll be here tomorrow, and the night after that, and the night after that. Still attending.